So Linda Bonyo is a digital law and data governance expert working on the regulation of emerging technologies in Africa, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she's got to say. And Adrian Joseph is a board member of Direct Line Group and is currently non-executive director to the People Board of the Cabinet Office. So could you just say a couple of words about yourselves and what you're doing, each of you? Introduce yourself to our audience here.
Thank you so much. I was going to say that I'm a dancer, but I am a lawyer. I've worked on law and technology for the past, I think, 10 years now. I founded the Lawyers Hub. We work at the intersection of law and technology. We bring together 2,500 lawyers across Africa every year to talk about law and technology. And 2 years ago, we had a huge summit on AI policy, which sounded very early, especially for Africa at that point. We also run a fellowship program that develops Africa's next digital policy talent. We currently have 24 fellows this year from 14 countries. In terms of artificial intelligence, we've been part of the AI governance framework in Kenya, coming up with a practitioner's guide on what that needs to look like, and very closely been working with the UN Tech Envoy on the Digital Compact in Africa especially, and a lot of other initiatives. So yeah, thank you.
Well, that is really interesting to hear about. Adrian, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing. And do we have one of those networks like Linda's just described? I think we need one if we haven't.
I'm going to set one up here, so yeah.
You're going to set one up?
Thanks for inviting me, yeah, I will.
Well, I was just saying, we're always describing ourselves as world leaders. It's a sort of habit, and world beating. But we've clearly got things to learn. Right, Adrian, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. So I've done a couple of things. I've been in the sort of applied AI space for the last 10 years. I was at Google for 10 years, joined Google just after Google IPO'd, and my last job involved in setting up and starting up the MarTech stack, which involved working very closely with data scientists and data engineers and a host of other sort of qualified experts in that space. And then I was the head of data and AI for EY in financial services. And then most recently, I left BT at the end of August, where I was a chief data and AI officer for BT, leading a team of about 1,600 people in cloud migration, in MLOps, and a host of other techniques that you would expect. So in addition to that, I've been on the AI Council, helping to advise the government on the national AI strategy, including regulation. And another passion of mine is diversity, equity, and inclusion, for which I was awarded an OBE. So that's a little bit about me. 3 passions: data, digital, and diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Excellent. Not one of the bad tech bros, then. Okay. So perhaps I can start with... you don't have to take the responsibility for all of them, though. But then again. Okay, so let's start with Linda. And what are we missing? It seems like we might be missing some things when it comes to including the wider global community in the discussion about safe and beneficial AI. What do you think we're missing?
Okay, so these are my very personal thoughts, and I'm going to be honest. I think that Britain is looking really inward, and maybe it's post-Brexit. I think there's an over-focus on who you are, and I was on a taxi yesterday, and he said, "Welcome to Britain," and he said, "Great Britain." I'm like, is it great? And I'm sorry if you think it's great at this point. It could be greater. But I think in terms of technology, we're seeing that other countries are actually making innovation, especially global south countries. And I like what you mentioned in the beginning about the divide. And I think when we look at how to change that, then we begin to look at people not looking like us. Because when you talk about the margins, we want people who look like us, whose hair is not all over the place, is in place, is dressed like us. I'm a lawyer trained in Kenya. And so being a Commonwealth country, I'm expected to be like a British lawyer. But I'm not. I'm an African lawyer. And that should show in how I run everything. I also think that because of lack of context, we sort of want the rest of the world to adopt AI just like we have adopted it. But we also want the rest of the world to move at this pace we had this discussion about, is really Britain late in the game? But I said, if Britain is late in the game, what about the rest of the world? So for example, we're struggling with digitization, just of records, health records from different ministries. And so when we talk about, your medical history, and we're saying, let's leverage data so we can build something just for you. And I don't want to say this. I went through cancer treatment 2 years ago, and it made me realize how powerful data is, because I have to carry my documents everywhere to begin to tell you the story of my life, that this is what I went through, this is where I was sick. But I can't do that if I don't have it. My government doesn't have it. How do we talk about data sharing and then start to leverage, countries like Estonia that have, data platforms that you can ideally just exchange data without necessarily compromising the security of such data? So I think all I'm saying is that we need to move away from looking internally to looking at these global aspects of the world, and then begin to look at where is the capital available for Britain to leverage on it? Where's the talent available? And so the second thing I'm going to talk about in light of your question is there's an interesting perspective on immigration that we need to talk about. 5 years ago, I applied to come to the UK for a conference, and my visa was denied. So I'm very loudmouthed on social media. I went on Twitter and ranted about my visa. So I think then the British Prime Minister, Maurice Johnson, had this whole Africa, UK trade, and he made this great speech, and somebody stood from the audience and said, if Linda Bonyo can't travel to the UK, what is this about Africa and the UK, when even African lawyers can't travel to come here? So it took me 5 years, and finally this year, I was invited by the Commonwealth, and they gave me a visa to come here. But I know why they denied the visa. Visas are structured in a way that it's a standardized form. It doesn't give you the opportunity to say that I'm famous, I know Beyonce, I can dance.
Do you?
And so, I wish I knew Beyonce, but I share the same hairdo with the husband. So all I'm saying that all this structure and questions, ideally building up on artificial intelligence. And so we're already having in Africa applications of artificial intelligence, especially in visa processing. And so people like us will not be able to tell our stories. And I think we need to move beyond it and begin to say, where can we have people like her to be in the room? And then we can have these discussions. And so I take this speaking opportunity seriously, because there's 10,000 lawyers who couldn't make it here today.
Can I go to Adrian now? You spent the last 10 years in applied AI. What have you seen and learned to radically and safely drive value in AI, particularly as it pertains to underrepresented groups? One day I hope we won't be sitting on a platform being called the margins, but for the moment we are. What have you seen that can change things?
So maybe a few comments about things that worry me. So I worry a lot about bias, and I think about 3 dimensions of bias. There's bias in the data, there's bias in the algorithms, and we need to take a lot of care in thinking about how those are managed and drift and all sorts of things. And then there's bias in the people that are building these algorithms. And I think, if we had better representation, we would have less sort of biased, discriminatory outcomes that we've seen, whether it's in policing or facial recognition or in applications that are more gender or ethnically biased, and a host of other areas that you can think about. But also things like, Gen AI, right? That if your first language is in English, and you're looking to detect Gen AI or large language models being used in education, people who don't speak English as a first language are much more likely to be classified as having used ChatGPT or some other product like that. So, and I think about Kenya, right? And I think about behind these big models, there's a lot of human intervention. We talk about AI as being, this thing with the finger, right? This kind of sentient thing. But actually, there's a lot of human intervention behind this. And, look at some of the, women in Kenya who are having to look at child sexual abuse and all sorts of extreme types of behaviors, and label data, right? And they're paid maybe a pound an hour or so. So I worry a lot about bias and how we can think about that. One of the big things I learned in all of the roles that I've done is to hire the most senior person I can for the type of diversity that I'm interested in. So at BT, I hired a head of AI who is a wonderful PhD lady in artificial intelligence, and what she did was to help to bring, you know, a lot more diversity into the business. Not just diversity in the gender sense, but diversity of thought, diversity of thinking about AI in a much more systemic way, and being really thoughtful about, you know, radically but also safely driving, you know, value. And when I say value, I mean both business value and societal value. So those are some of the things that I would think about. I think being really clear about priorities. So we had a really strong framework for thinking about, you know, what are the use cases that are most going to be impacted by AI? And how do we work with teams, right? We need to have domain expertise, people actually understand, you know, that part of the business or the particular challenge, working side by side with more technical teams to deliver the value unlock in my view. So those are just some of the things that I have thought about. One mistake I think I made, and I didn't think hard enough about sort of responsible AI and data governance until we had a bit of a scare around a near cybersecurity threat. And then I thought about it a lot. And so, you know, the whole area of data assurance, of data integrity, of data trust is absolutely fundamental to unlocking the value in AI. And I think is going to become a much more fundamental skill. I can see people being data assurance leads and a host of other types of capabilities that I think maybe the Big Four and others would get involved with.
And that'll be an issue for regulation as well, very much, won't it?
Yeah. It will be. I mean, we have 30 times the number of people, you know, working on developing AI than in thinking about regulation, ethics, and trust. That's just not sustainable. We have more regulation on a sandwich than we have on artificial intelligence. You know, that's just not sustainable in my view.
Can I go back to Linda and ask then about AI laws and regulations made here and the deployment of AI here, how they impact people beyond our borders? I mean, you mentioned your visa thing. I mean, you know, I see that not as your loss, not being able to come here 5 years ago.
Right.
And during those 5 years, that is our loss. I mean, that's like turning it around, you know. And I think it's inclusion has got to be seen as something we need, a kind of technological imperative, not philanthropic somehow. That's the problem. It's locked into the do-gooding area, isn't it, rather than an essential business thing. But talk a bit about laws and regulations and how what we do here might impact people beyond our borders. You touched on it briefly, but just expand on that if you would.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe push a bit the idea that you started about on immigration, which I think that is going to, we need to have a look at how AI is being used at the borders. So I've traveled to a lot of countries, and last week I checked myself out of Dubai, you know, so you're your own immigration officer, which feels so powerful. So if you go to the US, they're using facial recognition already just for you to go through immigration. The first time I was like, how am I going to show my relatives that I was in the US? Because there's no stamp on my passport. Like, that's what I need to show them. But then when you look at the AI bill from European Union, it really exempts the use of facial recognition, but for immigration, they ideally are focusing on using that. So what we're doing is saying that we protect our people, but we're considering immigrants and refugees and people like that. We can use any technology on them, you know, which is not right. I think we need some sort of red lines and say that this is how far we can come, especially with human rights and humanity. So this rules sort of apply, you know, across the board. I'd also want to, I think, mention that we have these technical exclusions. So for instance, there's an embassy in my country, and they don't deny you visas. They just make sure their online portal doesn't work. And so you can't get a calendar to that unless you know the ambassador.
Which country is this?
France. Please don't quote me.
So that's all private.
No, it's live stream, so it's fine. So their calendar just doesn't work, and I've complained about it. So I needed a visa. I went to the embassy, and my hair was looking worse than it's looking today. And so I went to the embassy, started shouting, you have to open this door. And then they opened it. And then they said, you have to come here with an appointment. And I said, I can't find it. It's been 2 months, and you can't get an appointment. And so what that does is nobody goes to France unless you know somebody at the embassy. And so we must begin to talk about these things about exclusion that are very technical, and sometimes we have it in terms of accessibility, like platforms that don't have other accessibility options, whether it's speech to text, whatever it is, we just don't have it on certain platforms. And what they say is, we don't need you here, but we're not going to say it.
That's very, very interesting.
On the laws that you talked about, I think that it's important to know the effect that Britain has on the rest of the world. I don't know, but I like memes. There's memes on social media about women's dresses with pockets. They're very useful. Yeah. So there's this meme about Idris Elba, and he has this picture, and he says that all my dresses with pockets say this, that I know the effect I have on women. So the policy effect that Britain has on the rest of the world is that most of the Commonwealth countries borrowed from your laws. Coming up with legislation is so expensive. That is why legislation is lobbied. And so we're seeing this from different aspects of the world where you have to pay to actually get legislation passed. And so I just read something today that not even today, but just before we came on stage, Kenya has just released a draft of the Kenya Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Society Bill 2023. And it talks about establishment of a society, it talks about protection from personal liability, the role of national governments, then it talks about licensing. And the way Kenya solves problems is just the way the Brits solve problems. Especially, I'm so sorry, your parliament. Like when I watch parliament bickering here, you have grandchildren in Kenya because they bicker the same way. The corruption that you talk about here, it's almost a similar way. It's the way you draft your legislation. And so what do we do? Because Africa cannot afford its own legislation, what do? We cut and paste. We go to GDPR and we say we can't hire consultants. We're going to copy it and paste it. Not really thinking about structure, because GDPR was looking at a powerful data protection office that's well-resourced, that's independent. We don't have independence. The president still appoints the data protection commissioner. Parliament still funds this particular body. And so we don't have those structures to ideally take Beyonce's hair or Jay-Z's hair on Linda's budget. So we have your laws, but without your budget.
Right, sounds like we need a bit of a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association discussion about AI. Is that happening, do you know?
No, not that I know of. Yeah.
Is it, Adrian, do we think?
Not that I'm aware of.
But I think that we should stop the policy exchange without the policy support. That then, if you're supporting you to do policy, it doesn't come with strings attached, that you must go for this. Because that's what happened with the European bodies as well, that there's a push for adoption of GDPR, and they're not alone. Different countries want to export, including China. What are their frameworks, and how does Africa take them? But in terms of artificial intelligence, do we actually have the data structure? Do we actually have the parliamentary and government structure to ideally handle in that particular sense?
Well, I think that's something that we definitely need to do. There's no point us thinking separately about how our select committees might breach that accountability gap,
right?
Without we think about how it's going to affect, the world generally that's looking at how we're doing parliamentary issues. Adrian, what about young people at the moment? What would you advise children in regard to their skills in this age of AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot. I have 3, they're not children any longer, they're all adults now, pretty much. And I think about the impact on work, and there are 3 A's that I think about. The first one is automation, and many of the jobs that we're doing that are high data entry, repeatable, predictable, are likely to be automated. So that's the first A. The second A is about augmentation, and pretty much everybody in this room, and I include me and everybody else, I think at the task level, We're going to see that algorithms are going to help us to do things, take some of the drudgery away, hopefully the drudgery. But we're also seeing, by the way, AI outperforming us in creative tasks. So there's a question about whether it is pure going to just do that, or it's actually going to do more, which of course the artists understand. And the third A, what are the additional roles that are going to be created? And of course, prompt engineering is a big area. But I also see, we need...
Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
About prompt engineering, so, some of the, I don't know if people were in here earlier today, but it's the question that you put into ChatGPT or to Bard or to Claude or whichever large language model that you're using, the prompt is really, really, really important. So I might put a prompt in for the mother of Tom Cruise. I put her name in and I say, who are the children? Who are the children of Tom Cruise's mother? It says, it'll give me an answer like, I can't possibly answer that type of question. Then I say, who is the mother of Tom Cruise? Mother of Tom Cruise is this lady. So, if A equals B, B doesn't always equal A. So that's just one example of how it's really, really important to ask the right questions. And, I now get a daily feed into my email box that gives me prompt advice, right? And some of them can be as long as a page to put into, a ChatGPT. So those are that prompt engineering. There'll be other roles that will be new or will need to be expanded. AI ethicists for sure. AI sort of culture change. The whole area of data assurance, I think, is going to become much more important. And it's a really hard thing to do. Watermarking is not necessarily a really easy thing to do. So what do I say to my children? I say, one, do the things that really make your soul shine. Do the things that you love. That's one. Second thing is, remember that most of the Nobel Prize winners have both deep creative backgrounds and also deep analytical backgrounds. And so we do need those two to work in tandem. And then just maybe one other point in this space of education, in a UK context, look at the research from Oxford or Cambridge or from the Royal Society. Our understanding of AI is about 25 to 30% of people in the civil world have an understanding of what AI is or can define it. But there's about 65 to 70% acceptance. There's a really strong correlation between AI understanding and AI acceptance. And I think if we did a lot more at a national level to make it really clear what is AI and what is not AI, where are the areas where it is safe to use, what are the areas that you need to be worried about, and that needs to go down to school children, to parents, and to teachers. If I make one more point on the point about parents is, a lot of our parents from certain ethnic groups say, you can be three things. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant. Those are great professions, right? But technology doesn't appear on those. And so we need our parents as well as our teachers and our students to be thinking about this much more holistically.
Right. Well, I think in terms of sort of all educating ourselves, somehow Parliament has got to, the members of Parliament have got to break through that barrier and get into that.
Absolutely. There's the 2 million...
25%.
That absolutely. And I think having more, I was on the board of the Home Office, right? I think the, Parliament, government need to have many more people who actually understand this, not just on the boards, but actually, leading some of these departments. There are 2 million people, 2 million children who are on free school meals. And guess what? If you're one of those children, your unemployment rate is 3 times higher than the more privileged kids. And if you have the same qualifications, you get paid 50% less. So there's a whole piece of work, I think, to be done about helping people from the point about privilege, from non-privileged backgrounds to have much better accessibility. And I worry that AI is going to potentially, if we don't manage it in the right way, it's going to make those discrepancies even higher.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to go to some of you in the audience here for questions. I think Rebecca's just going to have to wave her arms around when we come to the end of the session, because I don't seem to have identified where the clock is. So we're on an infinite session here. So just give me a shout or give me a sign when we're 5 minutes off. So who would like to ask a question? And having said it's an infinite session, could I suggest you keep your questions brief and say who you'd like to give an answer, from Linda or Adrian? Over there. Hi. And say who you are as well, a bit of your life story.
Hi, I'm Ingrid from TechCrunch. I had a question for Linda. I'm curious what your thoughts are on Wellcoin in Kenya. That's a big AI question and raises all sorts of, issues around digital divides and exploitation, personal data, etc.
I can go ahead and answer. Yeah, so your colleague from Kenya asked to interview me, but we didn't have time to do it. So Wellcoin had, we all know how Wellcoin, right?
Just explain a little bit about what it is.
So it's a company, I think, owned by OpenAI's founder, and they have this sort of digital currency, and they were collecting sort of eyeballs. They have this machine, you scan your eye, and then they give you a piece of some digital currency and say they're going to pay you in several weeks, which was about maybe less than £60. And so they had lots of people coming in who are poor because they need this particular amount of money. They took the eyeballs and stuff, the iris scan, and then finally they said it's not working, the coin went down, and the data commissioner reined in on them. The government said that it's illegal. And so now the government, I think, did an inquiry, and there's a report out this past weekend on Wellcoin. I think that my view is America should have reined on big tech a long time ago. It's caused problems in the rest of the world. I think they have really good technology, which we all use, but internally, because this was never fixed in a long time, what happens is the rest of the world then bears the brunt of what happens when you don't rein in on big tech. I think we should be comfortable enough, and we're seeing this with the AI conversations, that there's too much over-focus on big tech companies. And so then we leave away and out of the room civil societies and governments at this particular point. Every single government that we've talked to has no capacity. They're all leaning so heavily on big tech companies and saying that we will rely on you to tell us what the standards are, what the regulation looks like, but then not noticing that this is really fast, a profit-first approach. But then we have people who do not care for the profit. We care for how do we use AI for humanity first before we go into profit making. And so I think that's a fundamental problem with the American system. And every system has problems. So what do we do to fix it? And I want to borrow lessons from the misinformation wars that we have seen. Many of the times we think that what's happening in Africa doesn't concern us, but then a lot of these technologies are first perfected in Africa and then used against you. We've seen it with the 2016 elections in the US, and we saw with Brexit and misinformation going on. They first perfected these technologies in Kenya, and then they came in and then used it in different countries, including, I think, Brazil and the Philippines. And so my point is that I think we need to look at the rest of the world in terms of policy support and seeing how we can ideally, and hold tech companies accountable, not just for what they do in the country, but what they do away from your specific country. I think that could be helpful. But from a privacy approach, I think this was not supposed to happen in any society. Nobody should be lining up and giving away their data for less than £60 just because they're broke. I think we need to fix it. And just in reference to what you've said, we are really keen at the Lawyers Hub to talk about labor in AI. Because we are seeing that our society, labor and work, in that particular context, we see Uber drivers, like we had traditional taxi companies that have now been sort of driven out of business. And in a country where a tech company has a larger GDP than your country's GDP, like if they have more profits, like Amazon is richer than my country. So how does my country really rein in on Amazon and say, this far you cannot come? They don't have the capacity. And I think that's why the calls by the Tech Envoy on a global digital cooperation framework in which we're able to cooperate like we've done for cybersecurity and other traditional ways. How do we then globally cooperate and say, these are the standards that we should have across the world? And then begin to look at platform workers who really are aiming for fair work. How do we treat ride-hailing app, the drivers who are working on this particular platform. So he talked about content moderators who in Kenya have already taken Facebook, for instance, to court around outsourcing and how much they pay and the violence that they're watching on this particular platform. So even the work of the labor lawyers is actually changing, employment lawyers. And now we're trying to sort of reskill them and say, ideally, this is what you should do. Civil society groups that are holding companies accountable on AI, these are the kind of harms that are propagated with this new technology, and this is what you need to do.
Thank you. Can we take 2 more questions? I'll take one in the front row and one over there.
Hi, I'm Jemima Olhavsky. I'm Chief Executive of the Foret Society. Harriet mentioned our research that's out tomorrow, which we've done in partnership with Virgin Media O2, which found that culture of sexism and discrimination really is endemic in the tech sector. One additional stat that really stood out to me is that 1 in 3 black women working in tech had been presumed to have a non-technical role. So given the power that the people in these roles have in shaping our lives and the way our society develops, what can be done to make sure that we take down that tech bro culture, and in particular, in a way that brings everyone with us rather than just those who are progressive and future-facing? And that's a question to Adrian, please.
Thanks, and I'll just have a question from over there. You've got the microphone.
My question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for this panel. I really, really appreciate it. In fact, I have, just before I got to this meeting today, I was actually speaking about a lot of this question.
A little bit?
That's okay, yeah. So I was speaking a lot about this question. How do we use AI, like Linda said, to put humanity before profit in this regard? I'm working with I'm working with a company called the Good Coffee Project, which I've founded, looking at problems in the coffee industry that have been effectively, the problem has been kicking my butt. And so I was just kind of looking at if there's any kind of practical advice you could offer me in terms of looking at countries like Kenya, that would basically be looking at these solutions and how we can implement them on a real and practical basis. And effectively, it's a big problem. So I'm wondering how I can help.
Thank you. So we've got one question to Adrian, one to Linda. Let's just have one more before we wrap up at the back there. Thank you.
Hiya. So my question, I guess, is to both.
Say who you are?
Oh, yes, of course. I'm Matthew Blakemore from AI Karumba, an AI consultancy. I'm just interested to know, one of the big issues I've noticed is the exploitation of overseas workers, especially with the widening gaps in society, and we're looking at privilege. We know, for example, OpenAI pay workers $2 an hour in Kenya, for example, to label all of their video works, and increasingly, as companies want to build these big models, they're going to need data labelers, and it just makes sense for them economically to exploit workers overseas. So the question I have for the panel is, how do we prevent that? And more deeply, do you think there needs to be regulation around this? Because what I see is a world in the future where a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, and data labeling is going to be a job that a lot of those people could potentially do. But if these companies are outsourcing it overseas to low-cost workers, then what we're going to see is those people who could be doing data labeling over here, for example, are not going to be able to. And so I'd be interested to see what your views are on, or to hear what your views are on that.
Well, 3 very different questions. Could I start with Adrian on that?
So I'll start on the first question, if I may. So it's another great question. Thank you for asking it. And it's not good enough that maybe 1 in 10 people in data science in the UK are female. It's not okay that we have 5% of people in leadership positions in technology, when 26 of them are female. That's not good enough. And so your question is, what can we do about it? So one of the things I fixate on a lot is the metrics. Show me the data, right? So at least we can start having that conversation. The second thing I think about is then setting measurable targets. We set targets for everything else, so why wouldn't we do the same in this area? The third thing I think is we need to, at much earlier in sort of 9-year-olds, and maybe 7 to 9-year-olds is the point where we need to help, more girls and all forms of diversity, but girls in particular. We need better ways of helping to explain and connect, why this matters, and in ways that are understandable and helpful to them. So, education at a much earlier stage. And I think we need, we need also to think about things like, I worry, right, in one of the organizations I worked with, it was clear that the men were really good at boasting, right? We're really good at doing this stuff, right? We're, annual appraisal, rah, I'm the best, right, ever. And women were not as good at shouting, right? So maybe not as good is not the right word to use, and that's not how I mean it. And so in calibration, for example, being able to reflect on that and actually ask the right sorts of questions, is this true? Is this really, show me the evidence on it. So I think there are a number of things around that. And then I think mentoring and particularly sponsorship is really, really important. Who's representing you in the room when you're not there that's going to advocate for you and going to help and guide you. So those are some of the things that I think about in that context. But I also think about how can we use AI, right, to better detect some of these biases and to give us nudges and to, help us to, for tailored learning development plans. These are all areas where AI can really help us. And so thinking about how we can expose biases and opportunities much more effectively by using AI to do this, I think is also an area for us to look at.
Thank you. And Linda, if you could answer the question from the Good Coffee Company and the question at the back on data.
I was going to talk about, sometimes the answer is, one is travel. I think that most of the world does not travel. And I see this with, where I come from, even if you don't travel, you're not opinionated. But it's different in the US. When you go to the US, you're very opinionated, but they've never been outside the US, which is problematic. I think that we should strive to make the world cheaper to travel, remove the bottlenecks, and for education to be cheaper so people can have context of what's happening where you come from. So I see this with the work we do. When I show people videos, especially partners, that's when they're like, oh my God, you're doing such amazing work. And I'm like, you didn't see that before? But it's because we haven't been to where they have been. And so I think that we need to encourage that. But then also I also think that we need to think about who in this particular era is suffering the most and needs technology the most. My mom is old, not really old, but she's 60. And I was reading about the life expectancy in Kenya and in Belgium. If I move to Belgium today, the life expectancy is 81, I think, when you check on Google. And in Kenya, it's 62. And so just by maybe being there, maybe, I don't know what happens, but you live longer. Sorry, where we come from, we say Europeans don't work. They walk their dog and smoke all day. But we work so hard, but for so little. So how do we make sure there's a balance in the world in terms of fair work and fair remuneration? I'm not sure we can solve that now, especially from the government side, our government side. But I think for nations like this is to begin to have national frameworks that ideally govern you outside your country. What we're doing at the Lawyers Hub is we are developing digital policy talent and saying, can we train more lawyers, more technologists, to actually look out and flag out these issues in the technologies that they're building so that they ideally build for, if you're building for privacy, if you're building for inclusivity, it's actually embedded in law. That would be important to do. But I also want to point out something in which every country is trying to make money, because we've seen what money does. It gives you dominance. Eventually, it gives you capital to be able to do this thing. So I think that maybe one of the things that should be done at the UK level, I really hope you can transform your visa process, because it's just making sure that only the rich people can come to Britain. The visas were, I think, the fees were either doubled or a third, was increased by a third this year. It's not right to charge that much to have somebody visit your country. There are other ways you could make money. We could grow tea and sell to you and things like that, but not the visa process. I think that needs to change. Number two, in terms of education, how do you test me every 2 years for my English? It's the same English you taught me. Because people actually have to pay so much money, like 200 euros, I think, for them to actually take the English exam to come to this particular country. I don't know if my English is any different. You can hear me. I'm not saying preposterous and atrocity and stuff like that, but you can clearly hear what I'm saying. I'm just simply saying that whatever business models worked before, especially for governments, they're driving us to exclude certain people in society, and that's not good.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I have to say I feel that there's a big role for the Equality and Human Rights Commission here. They need to do an investigation into this sector. They need to set targets, and if the targets are not met, set quotas, and then if the quotas are not complied with, they need to have the power to fine, to enforce. But that's just a brief bit of shorthand. Can I thank you, the audience, for your questions, and also hugely thank our panel.